On the morning of October the 14th, a mail carrier named Dale Whitfield walked up the gravel path to the Calloway house on Birch Hollow Road, the same route he'd walked 3 times a week for 11 years, and noticed something that made him stop before he even reached the porch. The newspaper from 2 days prior was still sitting in its plastic sleeve at the end of the driveway, untouched, soaked through from an overnight rain. The porch light was on, even though it was nearly 10 in the morning, burning weakly against the gray daylight, like something that had been left on by accident and simply never noticed. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and called out the way you do when you already suspect something is wrong, but haven't admitted it to yourself yet. Through the front window, gauzy curtains pulled most of the way closed, he could see a single lamp glowing in the living room, and on the coffee table, undisturbed, a half-finished puzzle, and 2 mugs of something long gone cold. He would later tell investigators that the stillness of the house felt different from an empty house. An empty house, he said, feels empty. This felt like a held breath. The Calloway family had lived in that small 2-story farmhouse on the outskirts of Mercer County for 9 years. Tom Calloway, 44, worked as a foreman at a regional lumber yard, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that built a life slowly and without much fanfare. His wife, Renee, 39, taught 3rd grade at Hollis Elementary, a job she'd held since before they were married, and was known around town for the little handwritten notes she left in her students' backpacks on test days. They had 2 children, Audrey, 16, a junior at Mercer County High, quiet, a talented violinist who'd been accepted into a regional youth orchestra the previous spring, and Caleb, 11, who, according to nearly everyone who knew him, never stopped talking, never stopped moving, the kind of kid who narrated his own life out loud as he lived it. By every account that investigators gathered in the weeks that followed, this was an unremarkable family in the best possible sense of that word. No debts spiraling out of control, no history of domestic disturbance calls, no affairs, no enemies, nothing that gave any obvious shape to what came next. The last confirmed contact anyone had with the Calloways was the evening of October the 12th, a Tuesday. Renee Calloway had texted her sister, Diane, around 8:40 p.m., a short message about a recipe for chicken and dumplings that Diane had asked for earlier that week. The message read, in full, exactly as Diane would later read it back to detectives word for word, because she had stared at it so many times since. Sending it tomorrow, can't find my glasses, lol, love you. Nothing alarming. Nothing that, read in isolation, would ever have made anyone's stomach drop. But it was the last thing anyone heard from any of them. Tom Calloway didn't show up for his 6 a.m. shift the next morning, which was so out of character that his supervisor, a man named Pete Reardon who'd worked alongside Tom for 6 years, said later that it was the single most alarming part of the entire case, to him personally. More than anything the police eventually found, or didn't find. Tom Calloway, he told a local reporter, had never missed a shift, not for a stomach flu, not for a snowstorm, not for his own father's funeral, where he came in afterward still wearing his good shoes. When Tom didn't answer his phone by mid-morning on the 13th, Pete called the house. No answer. He called again that afternoon. Still nothing. It wasn't until the following morning, when the mail carrier noticed the soaked newspaper and the burning porch light, that anyone physically went to check. When Dale Whitfield's repeated knocking produced no response, and his gut told him something was deeply wrong, he called the Mercer County Sheriff's Department rather than try the door himself, a decision that would later be noted approvingly in the case file as the reason the scene was preserved in its original state. Deputies arrived within 20 minutes. What they found, or rather, what they did not find, would come to define the case for the better part of a decade. The front door was locked. Not just closed, locked, deadbolted from the inside, the kind of lock that, structurally, cannot be engaged from outside without a key, and the Calloways, like many families in that part of the county, did not believe in giving spare keys to neighbors or hiding one under a flower pot. Their only spare was, as it turned out, hanging on a hook inside the kitchen, exactly where it always hung. The back door, off the kitchen, was also locked, the same internal deadbolt mechanism engaged. Every window on the ground floor was not only closed but locked from the inside. The old-fashioned twist latches all rotated into position, several of them painted over with decades of accumulated paint that had clearly not been disturbed recently. Upstairs, the same story. Locked windows, an attic hatch that hadn't been opened in what looked like years, judging by the undisturbed dust along its frame. There was no broken glass anywhere, no forced hinges, no pried frames, no scratch marks around any lock that would suggest tampering. The home's single security camera, a battery-powered doorbell unit Tom had installed 2 years prior, mostly to catch package thieves, had stopped recording at 9:14 p.m. on the night of the 12th, not because it had been disabled or removed, but because, according to the manufacturer's own diagnostic data pulled later by a forensic technician, its battery had simply died at that exact time, a battery that, oddly, had been replaced only 17 days earlier and should have had, by the manufacturer's own estimates, weeks of charge remaining. Deputies eventually forced entry through the back door, the report noting the unusual difficulty officers had even breaking a standard residential deadbolt designed to resist exactly that kind of forced entry, requiring a battering ram and nearly 4 full minutes of repeated strikes. Inside, the house told a story that made no sense when set against the locked perimeter. Nothing was disturbed. There were no signs of struggle anywhere in the house. No overturned furniture, no broken dishes, no blood, no defensive marks on any surface. Nothing pulled from drawers or shelves in haste. The dining table held 2 coffee mugs, cold, with a faint ring of evaporated liquid at the bottom of each, consistent with having been poured and then left undrunk sometime the previous evening. Caleb's homework, a math worksheet on long division, sat on the kitchen counter, 4 problems completed in neat pencil, the 5th abandoned mid-calculation, the pencil itself resting beside it at an angle that suggested it had simply been set down, not dropped. Audrey's violin case lay open on her bed upstairs, the instrument inside, untouched, alongside a practice notebook with that day's date written at the top, and nothing else filled in beneath it. In the master bedroom, the bed was made, the way Renee apparently made it every single morning according to her sister. Tight hospital corners, a habit from her own mother. Nothing suggested anyone had slept in it that night, or that anyone had been in any particular hurry to leave it. All 4 family members' phones were found in the house, 3 of them on chargers in their respective bedrooms. 1, Renee's, on the kitchen counter beside her purse, which still contained her wallet, her driver's license, $41 in cash, and her car keys. Tom's truck was in the driveway, his work boots by the back door, his own phone on his nightstand at 11% battery. No vehicle was missing from the property. No clothing appeared to be missing either, according to an inventory Diane helped detectives compile weeks later, comparing what remained in closets against photographs and her own memory of what each family member typically wore, though she would later admit, almost apologetically, that this kind of inventory is never perfect, that you can't truly know with certainty what a 16-year-old girl owns down to the last folded shirt. It is worth pausing here, before the investigation widens, to sit for a moment in the particular wrongness of that scene, because what makes it so difficult to describe later, what investigators themselves struggled to put into words in their own reports, is that nothing about it looked like tragedy in the way tragedy is supposed to look. There was no violence written into the rooms. There was, if anything, an almost obscene ordinariness to it all. A kitchen mid-Tuesday, a child's homework half-finished, a violin case open and waiting, the kind of tableau you might walk past 100 times in your own home without ever once registering it as significant. It became significant only because the people who belonged in that tableau were gone, and because, for reasons no one could explain, The house had sealed itself around their absence like a wound, closing over something that was never properly removed. The investigation that followed was, by the standards of a rural sheriff's department with limited resources, remarkably thorough, in part because the case drew state police involvement within the first 72 hours, and in part because the sheer strangeness of the locked house anomaly meant that no theory could be dismissed too quickly. Sheriff Earl Doss, a man nearing the end of a long career who had, by his own admission to a reporter years later, never encountered anything resembling this case in 3 decades of rural law enforcement, personally walked the property line 3 times in the first week, looking for anything: a gap in a fence, a culvert, a worn path through tall grass, that might explain how 4 people could leave a sealed house unseen. He found nothing. The property itself sat on roughly 11 acres, bordered on 2 sides by dense woodland that gave way eventually to a state forest preserve, and on the other 2 sides by open farmland belonging to a neighboring family who had farmed that land for 3 generations, and who, in their own interviews, reported nothing unusual on the night in question beyond the persistent and uncharacteristic barking of their own livestock dog sometime after dark. The early working theory, the one that almost always comes first in cases like this, was some kind of staged disappearance, a family choosing, for reasons known only to themselves, to walk away from their lives and vanish, perhaps fleeing debt, perhaps fleeing a threat they hadn't disclosed to anyone, perhaps something more troubling still. Investigators pulled financial records going back 5 years. They found nothing. No hidden accounts, no large withdrawals in the weeks prior, no indication of any plan to relocate or any communication with anyone outside the immediate family suggesting such a plan. Tom's 401k, modest as it was, sat untouched. Renee's school district pension remained active and was never claimed, not once, in all the years since. If this was a family that planned to disappear, they left without a single dollar they were entitled to, which is, investigators would later note, almost unheard of in genuine voluntary disappearance cases, where money, however carefully hidden, almost always moves. A second theory centered on Tom himself, the assumption, uncomfortable but standard procedure, that the husband and father might be responsible for harming his own family and then disposing of them before vanishing himself. This theory collapsed almost immediately under its own logistics. Cell tower data placed Tom's phone inside the house, pinging the same residential tower until its battery died around 11 p.m. on the 12th. There was no gap in the timeline large enough for one man to kill 3 people without leaving any trace of struggle, transport 4 bodies without a vehicle that ever left the property, dispose of them somewhere undiscovered despite an extensive search involving cadaver dogs across more than 600 acres of surrounding farmland and forest, and then vanish himself on foot in October in rural Mercer County, without being seen by a single person, without using a credit card, without his body or his family's bodies ever surfacing in 9 years since. Cadaver dogs, brought in on the 3rd day of the search, alerted briefly near a drainage culvert roughly half a mile from the house, an alert that sent the investigation into a tense 48 hours of excavation. Nothing was found there beyond the remains of a deer carcass that had likely been there for months, explaining the alert but deepening, somehow, the unease around the case rather than resolving any part of it. A third theory, raised quietly and then largely set aside, involved the possibility of a home invasion so controlled and so silent that it left no physical evidence at all. Intruders who somehow gained entry, subdued 4 people without a sound loud enough to wake the nearest neighbors roughly a quarter mile down the road, relocked every door and window behind themselves on the way out, and left with 4 adults and children without a single drop of blood, a single broken object, a single footprint in the soft mud that ringed the property after the rain that night. Forensic teams processed the entire house for fingerprints, fibers, and trace evidence, and found nothing inconsistent with the family's own routine presence in their home. No unidentified DNA, no unfamiliar fingerprints, The mud outside, still soft and undisturbed from rainfall that had started around 7 p.m. on the 12th and continued intermittently through the night, held only the Callaways' own footprints near the house, the dog's prints. The family owned an aging golden retriever named Biscuit who was found, alive, calm, and apparently well-fed, sitting in the laundry room when deputies entered, a detail that unsettled almost everyone connected to the case more than almost any other single fact. Because a family dog, investigators noted, does not typically remain calm in a house where something violent or chaotic has occurred to its owners. Biscuit showed no signs of distress, no signs of having barked extensively, nothing in his demeanor suggesting trauma, and was eventually taken in by Diane, who said in an interview years later that the dog never again slept anywhere except directly in front of the back door, every single night, for the rest of his life. Investigators returned again and again to the question of the dog, because in a case so thoroughly emptied of physical evidence, behavior became evidence in its own strange way. A veterinarian consulted early in the investigation noted that Biscuit showed no elevated stress markers, no injuries, nothing in his physical condition inconsistent with a normal, uneventful overnight period. If something violent had occurred in that house, the vet said carefully, in the kind of language professionals use when they don't want to overstate a conclusion, you would generally expect to see some trace of it in the animal, a refusal to eat, an unusual wariness, something. Biscuit displayed none of it. He ate his breakfast, deputies noted, almost immediately after they entered, as though nothing at all had changed in his world except the unfamiliar uniforms around him. Neighbors were interviewed extensively in the days following the discovery, and their accounts, while not contradictory exactly, added a quiet, cumulative strangeness to the timeline. The Hendersons, who lived in the nearest house down the road, reported that their own dog had barked persistently and unusually around 9:30 p.m. on the night of the 12th, barking at the tree line behind their property rather than toward the road, which they found odd only in hindsight, since at the time they assumed it was a raccoon or a deer and went to bed without investigating. Another neighbor, an elderly widow named Esther Pruitt, who lived nearly a mile away but had a clear line of sight to the Callaway property across an open field, mentioned almost as an afterthought during her interview that she'd noticed the porch light at the Callaway house doing something funny sometime after 10 that night. Flickering, she said, in a way she'd never seen it do before, on and off several times over the course of maybe 20 minutes, though she admitted she hadn't thought much of it, and had gone to bed shortly after. When investigators checked the porch light's wiring, they found nothing electrically wrong with it. The fixture worked perfectly. No explanation was ever found for the flickering Esther described, and her account was never independently corroborated, since no one else in the area reported noticing it. A third neighbor, a man named Curtis Bell who lived alone roughly half a mile up the road and kept odd, insomniac hours, told deputies he'd been outside that night around 11, checking on a fence line after the rain had briefly let up, and that he'd seen what he described, hesitantly, as a kind of glow coming from the direction of the Callaway property, low to the ground, brief, gone within a few seconds. He was quick to qualify the statement, telling investigators he assumed it was likely a passing car's headlights reflecting off something, or heat lightning, which does occur in that part of the county in October, though less commonly than in summer months. He was equally quick to say that something about it had unsettled him enough that he'd gone back inside immediately afterward rather than continue checking his fence, a decision he found himself unable to fully explain even to himself. Investigators logged the statement, noted that no other resident reported anything matching it, and filed it, like so much else in this case, under the heading of unverifiable but unable to be dismissed. A more troubling detail emerged about 10 days into the investigation, when forensic technicians processing audio from a neighbor's exterior security camera, positioned roughly 600 yards from the Callaway property, angled mostly toward that neighbor's own driveway, but with a faint, ambient microphone pickup, isolated a sound in the recording from approximately 11:47 p.m. on the night of the 12th. The sound was faint, layered under wind and the ongoing light rain, and analysts disagreed for weeks about what it actually was. The official case file describes it conservatively as an indistinct vocalization, possibly human, duration approximately 2 seconds, directionality inconclusive. Off the record, 2 of the audio technicians who worked on the enhancement told a journalist years later, separately and without knowing the other, had said the same thing, that it sounded to them like a single word, spoken or perhaps shouted at a distance, and that the word, distorted as it was, sounded like, "wait." Neither would say so on the record. The recording itself has never been made public, and the Sheriff's Department has consistently declined to release it, citing the ongoing, technically still open status of the case. There is something about that detail, more than almost anything else in the file, that has stayed with the small community of researchers and amateur investigators who have followed this case over the years, because of how little it actually tells you and how much it nonetheless seems to imply. A single word, captured almost by accident, on the edge of audibility, at the exact hour when, by every other measure, the Callaway household should already have been winding down for the night. Was it Tom's voice? Was it Renee's? Was it one of the children, calling out to a sibling somewhere else in the house, or calling out to something else entirely? The recording's quality was never sufficient to determine even the speaker's approximate age or gender with any confidence, according to the Audio Lab's final assessment, and the directionality analysis, an attempt to determine whether the sound had originated from inside the house, from the yard, or from somewhere further out toward the tree line, produced results the lab itself described as inconclusive within the bounds of statistical confidence they were comfortable reporting. As the investigation widened into its second and third weeks, it expanded into the family's broader social circle, looking for anything, any thread, any grudge, any debt, any secret that might explain what had happened. Tom Callaway's co-workers described him as reliable to the point of being almost boring, a man who coached Caleb's Little League team in the summers and rarely missed a Sunday at the small Baptist church the family attended on the edge of town. Pastor Wendell Greer, who had known the family for the better part of a decade, said in his own interview that he had spoken with Tom only 4 days before the disappearance, a brief conversation after the previous Sunday's service about nothing more significant than a leak in the church's roof that Tom had offered to help patch. He recalled nothing unusual in Tom's demeanor, no sign of distress, no hint of anything weighing on him beyond the ordinary concerns of a man balancing work and family. "If you had told me that Tuesday morning that this family would be gone within 48 hours, he told a reporter later, I would have told you that you had the wrong family entirely. There was nothing about them that made sense as a vanishing." Renee's fellow teachers described a woman beloved by her students, occasionally stressed about her aging mother's declining health 2 states away, but otherwise unremarkable in the way that most good, steady people are unremarkable to outside observers. One colleague, a teacher named Marjorie Fenn, who had shared a classroom wall with Renee for 6 years, mentioned something during her interview that investigators noted but were never able to develop into anything substantial, that in the final week before the disappearance, Renee had seemed, in Marjorie's words, distracted in a way that wasn't like her, forgetting small routine things, double-booking a parent conference, leaving her classroom lights on overnight, on at least 2 occasions that the building's night custodian remembered, specifically because it was unlike her. Marjorie was careful to say she didn't think anything was wrong, exactly, just that Renee had seemed somewhere else in her thoughts that week, somewhere Marjorie hadn't been able to place and hadn't thought to ask about, because why would you, in an ordinary week, in an ordinary life? The one genuinely unusual thread investigators pulled on, and pulled on hard for several weeks, involved Audrey. In the months before the disappearance, several of her friends mentioned, somewhat reluctantly, that she had become quieter, more withdrawn, spending long stretches of time alone in her room with the door closed, a change her mother had apparently mentioned with some worry to at least 2 other parents at school functions, though never anything specific, never anything that suggested fear or danger, more the ordinary worry of a mother watching her teenage daughter pull slightly inward, the way teenagers often do. One friend, a girl named Priya Anand, who had known Audrey since middle school and described herself as her closest friend, said that Audrey had seemed, in the weeks before, like she was carrying something she didn't want to put into words. But Priya was careful, in her interview, to say this could just as easily have been ordinary teenage anxiety about the upcoming youth orchestra auditions, or some private worry about a boy, or nothing at all, the kind of mood that passes through adolescence, the way weather passes through a season, without ever needing a name. Audrey's school-issued laptop was recovered from her room, and a forensic review of her browser history in the final weeks before the disappearance showed nothing alarming on its surface. Homework research, music theory websites, video tutorials for violin technique, except for one detail that investigators never fully explained. On 3 separate occasions in the final 2 weeks, always late at night, always for only a few minutes, she had searched variations of the same phrase. Houses that disappear, families gone overnight, locked room no evidence. No further context was ever found. No messages, no journal entries, no conversations with friends that referenced these searches or explained them. It remains, in the case file, an open and uncomfortable question whether Audrey had somehow sensed something coming, was researching out of unrelated curiosity sparked by some television show or podcast, or whether the searches meant something else entirely that no one has ever been able to reconstruct. A digital forensics consultant brought in roughly a year into the investigation noted, almost reluctantly, in his supplementary report, that the timing of these searches, always between 11 p.m. and half past midnight, always conducted in brief, almost furtive bursts, rather than extended browsing sessions, suggested someone checking something rather than someone idly curious, though he stopped well short of speculating what that something might have been, and acknowledged in the same paragraph that this interpretation was, by his own admission, more intuition than science. Caleb's life, by contrast, offered investigators almost nothing to work with, and in its own way this absence became its own kind of evidence. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of 11-year-old boy he appeared to be on the surface, obsessed with a popular trading card game, recently moved up to the advanced reading group at school, perpetually scraped at the knees from a summer spent climbing the old oak tree at the edge of the property. His teacher described him as the kind of student who raised his hand for everything, right answer or not, simply because he liked being part of the conversation. Nothing in his school records, his few social media interactions on a tightly monitored kids platform his parents allowed him limited access to, or his friends' accounts of him in the weeks before, suggested anything out of the ordinary. If Caleb knew something, sensed something, carried any part of whatever happened that night, he left no trace of it behind that anyone has ever been able to find, and there is something particularly hard, Diane has said more than once, about a child vanishing so completely and so silently that even his absence offers no clues, as though the not knowing closed over him fastest of all. Months passed. The initial wave of media coverage, intense for the first several weeks, eventually faded the way these things do, replaced by other stories, other tragedies, other news cycles. The Mercer County Sheriff's Department, under increasing pressure from Diane and from a small but devoted community of amateur investigators who had taken an interest in the case online, brought in outside consultants twice over the following 2 years. Once a retired FBI profiler who specialized in family disappearance cases, and once a forensic engineer asked specifically to examine and re-examine the mechanics of the locked doors and windows to determine, definitively, whether there was any plausible way the house could have been locked from the outside using some method investigators hadn't considered. The engineer, a meticulous man named Holbrook, who had spent 30 years consulting on insurance fraud and forced entry cases, approached the Callaway house with what he later described as genuine skepticism toward the idea that it represented any real mystery at all. He assumed, going in, that he would find something, a manipulable lock mechanism, a window that could be relatched from outside using a tool slipped through a gap, some overlooked physical explanation that simply hadn't occurred to the original deputies on scene. He spent 4 full days at the property, testing every lock, every latch, every hinge, photographing and documenting his findings with the thoroughness of a man who expected, and rather wanted, to solve the case through pure mechanical reasoning. His final report, 11 pages long, concluded that while it was theoretically possible to manipulate certain older deadbolt mechanisms from outside using specialized tools and considerable time, the specific hardware installed in the Callaway home, replaced only the previous year as part of a home insurance-mandated security upgrade, was a newer model specifically designed to resist exactly that kind of manipulation, and showed no microscopic tool marks, no scratches, no evidence of tampering of any kind under electron microscope analysis. His report ends with a single sentence that has been quoted in nearly every piece of writing about the case since. Based on all available physical evidence, the residence was secured from within by occupants who, as far as this investigation can determine, never left it. He would later tell Diane, in a phone call she has described as one of the strangest conversations of her life, that he had never in his career written a conclusion like that, and that some part of him had wanted to keep looking, to keep testing, because the alternative, that the house had simply been locked, correctly, completely, by people who were no longer inside it when it mattered, felt, in his words, like accepting a kind of physics I don't have a name for. The profiler's assessment, delivered roughly 18 months into the investigation, focused less on mechanics and more on behavior, on the strange absence of any behavioral red flags in a family that, statistically, almost always shows some warning sign before something catastrophic happens to them. His name was Raymond Dietz, and he had built a long career studying family annihilation cases and staged disappearances, the kind of work that leaves a person, by his own admission, permanently and quietly altered by what they've had to learn to recognize in ordinary domestic life. He spent 3 weeks reviewing the case file, conducting his own follow-up interviews with neighbors, co-workers, and Diane, and walking the property himself on a gray December afternoon, nearly 14 months after the disappearance, standing for a long while, by Diane's account, in the doorway of Caleb's room, without saying anything at all. He noted, in language that unsettled Diane considerably when she eventually read it, that the case exhibited what he called a complete absence of escalation, no build-up, no warning, no slow unraveling of the kind investigators typically look for and typically find, however small in retrospect. In nearly every comparable case I have studied across 30 years, he wrote, there is always something, a fight overheard by a neighbor, a strange withdrawal 6 months prior, a financial irregularity, however small. Here, there is nothing. The Callaway family's life simply stops, mid-sentence, mid-puzzle, mid-homework problem, without any discernible lead-up whatsoever. This absence is, in my professional opinion, the single most significant anomaly in the case. He did not offer a theory for what might cause such a thing. He was not asked to, and by his own admission, he did not have one. In a private conversation with Diane, that she has only spoken about publicly once, in a long-form podcast interview marking the 7th anniversary of the disappearance, Dietz reportedly told her that in all his years of work, he had developed a kind of internal taxonomy for disappearance cases. Explainable ones, unexplainable but probably explainable ones, and a very small third category he had never been able to properly name. Cases that resisted every framework he had ever built for understanding why families come apart. He told her, she said, that the Calloway case belonged in that third category and that he found himself unable, even after decades in the field, to offer her the comfort of a theory, because every theory he had tried to construct collapsed against some detail of the physical evidence the moment he tested it. "I have spent my whole career learning how people disappear," he reportedly told her. "I do not know how to explain a family that simply isn't there anymore, in a house that was never opened." Over the following years, the case slipped slowly into the particular limbo reserved for the genuinely unsolved, kept formally open, revisited occasionally when a tip came in, most of which led nowhere, a handful of which led to brief, painful flares of hope for Diane that always, eventually, dimmed back into nothing. A woman matching Renee's general description was reported in a grocery store 3 states away, roughly 14 months after the disappearance, prompting a flurry of activity that ended when store security footage, recovered after several days of delay, showed clearly that the woman, while superficially similar in height and hair color, was not Renee Calloway. A psychic, of the kind that attaches itself to high-profile missing persons cases with some regularity, contacted the department twice with detailed claims about a wooded area roughly 40 miles from the Calloway property. Both searches, conducted more out of due diligence than genuine expectation, turned up nothing. A man calling himself a former acquaintance of Tom's, from his years working briefly in another state, before the family settled in Mercer County, came forward roughly 3 years after the disappearance, with a vague and ultimately unverifiable claim about a debt Tom had supposedly owed to people he described only as dangerous. A claim that investigators pursued for several weeks before concluding the man had no actual knowledge of the Calloways at all, and appeared, based on later inconsistencies in his story, to have fabricated the connection entirely, for reasons that were never made clear. Perhaps attention, perhaps something stranger. The case file grew thick with these dead ends. Each one logged, each one closed out, none of them bringing investigators any closer to an answer. There were smaller, stranger threads too, the kind that rarely make it into official summaries of a case, but that linger in the margins of a file like this one, noted by an investigator in passing, and never quite resolved. A woman who lived 2 counties over contacted the department roughly 2 years into the case, insisting she had dreamed, repeatedly and with unusual specificity, of a kitchen calendar and a porch light, details she could not have known from any public reporting on the case, since neither detail had been released to the press at that point. Investigators interviewed her, found nothing actionable in what she described, and noted, somewhat uncomfortably, that her description of the porch light doing something strange echoed Esther Pruitt's account almost word for word, despite the 2 women having no known connection to one another, and the dreaming woman insisting she had never heard of the case before her dreams began. Whether this represents genuine coincidence, some half-remembered fragment of local gossip she had absorbed without realizing it, or something investigators were simply unequipped to categorize, the file offers no conclusion, only the careful, non-committal language of officers documenting something they did not know what to do with. Diane Whitcomb, Renee's sister, has spent 9 years now maintaining a small website and social media presence dedicated to keeping her family's case in public memory, updating it periodically with anniversary posts, with renewed appeals for tips, with the kind of patient, exhausted persistence that anyone who has lived alongside an unsolved disappearance eventually learns by necessity. She has described, in various interviews over the years, the particular cruelty of a case like this one, the way it denies a person even the bitter comfort of certainty. With most losses, she said in one interview, even terrible ones, there's an ending. You bury someone, you know what happened, even if you wish you didn't. We don't have that. We have a house that locked itself and a family that stopped existing in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and 9 years of nothing in between. In an interview marking the 8th anniversary, she said something that has since been repeated widely in true crime circles discussing the case, something that captures, perhaps better than any official report, the particular horror of what happened to her sister's family. "Everyone wants there to be a villain," she said. "A bad man who broke in, a debt that went wrong, something with a shape to it, something you could be angry at. I used to want that too. Now I think what scares me more is that there might not be one, that something simply opened, somewhere in that house, on that ordinary Tuesday, and they walked through it, and it closed again behind them, and locked itself, the way doors are supposed to." She has spoken, too, about the particular weight of the small physical details that remain. The puzzle on the coffee table, eventually disassembled and boxed away because she could not bear to look at it any longer. Caleb's unfinished math worksheet, which she kept, framed, in her own home for years before finally putting it away in a drawer she has not opened since. Audrey's violin, which Diane had restrung and kept tuned for the first 3 years after the disappearance, out of some half-formed, never-spoken hope that it might matter, that it might need to be ready, before finally allowing herself to let it sit silent in its case, the way it had been found. The house itself still stands on Birch Hollow Road, though no one has lived in it since. Diane couldn't bring herself to sell it, not out of any belief that her sister and the children would return to it, but out of a feeling she has described as obligation, the sense that someone should keep it standing, keep it from being torn down or repurposed or erased, as though the structure itself were the last remaining witness to whatever happened inside it. Local teenagers have, predictably, turned it into a minor legend over the years, the kind of half-true ghost story passed around at parties, and the sheriff's department has had to respond more than once to reports of trespassers found wandering the property at night, drawn by curiosity or by something darker, looking for a feeling they couldn't quite name. Most are simply teenagers looking for a scare, and the deputies who respond send them home with little more than a warning. A handful of those trespassers, over the years, have reported things they later described, somewhat sheepishly, in posts on local online forums dedicated to the case. A cold spot in the upstairs hallway that several visitors, independently and without prior knowledge of each other's accounts, described in nearly identical terms. A sense, common enough to be almost a cliché in stories like this one, of being watched from an upstairs window, despite the house being thoroughly secured and unoccupied. Once, memorably, a small group of college students who had driven out from a nearby university town reported that the porch light, long disconnected from any power source after Diane had the electricity to the property shut off entirely 4 years after the disappearance, had appeared to them, for just a moment, to flicker on. None of these accounts carry any evidentiary weight, of course, and most can likely be explained by the ordinary mechanisms of suggestion and fear that operate on anyone standing alone at night outside a house with a story like this one attached to it. But they accumulate year over year in the way that stories about haunted places always accumulate, less because any single account is credible, and more because something about the original facts of the case, the locked doors, the untouched homework, the calm and unbothered dog, seems to invite this kind of elaboration, as though the real mystery were not strange enough on its own and needed company. But there is one detail, logged almost as an afterthought in a supplementary report filed nearly 6 years after the original disappearance, that has never been adequately explained, and that has, in the years since it became known to the small community following the case, taken on a weight far beyond its modest place in the file. During a routine property check, something Diane had arranged periodically, mostly to ensure the house remained secure and undisturbed, the deputy conducting the walkthrough noted, almost in passing, that the kitchen calendar, the same one that had hung on the wall since before the disappearance, untouched, preserved exactly as investigators had found it 9 years prior, with October circled in Renee's handwriting and small notes for school events, and Caleb's Little League schedule filling its squares, had been turned, not removed, not damaged, simply turned, page by page, from October of that original year forward to the current month, as though someone, at some point in the intervening years, had quietly kept it updated, month after month, the way you might absent-mindedly turn a calendar in a house you still considered, in some sense, your own. The deputy assumed at first that Diane must have done it during one of her own visits. Diane, when asked, said she never had. She told investigators and later told a reporter that she had never once touched that calendar, that she'd always found something unbearable about the idea of moving past October at all, and that she had left it exactly as it was, deliberately, every single time she walked through that house, because some part of her could not let that month end. The sheriff's department, to its credit, did not dismiss the detail. They processed the calendar for fingerprints, the same way they had processed everything else in that house 9 years prior, and found, as with everything else, only the family's own prints, layered now beneath a faint patina of accumulated dust and disuse that made it impossible to determine with any forensic precision when, exactly, the pages had last been touched. There was no evidence of forced entry into the house during any of the intervening years. Diane had maintained the property's locks and had the sole working key, a fact she has repeated, almost defensively, in every interview where the detail of the calendar has come up since. No one else, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, had access to that house at all. No one has ever determined who turned the pages. Before that detail surfaces, though, it's worth returning to the earlier years of the investigation, to the long, grinding middle of it, the part that rarely makes it into the shorter retellings of the case, but that shaped, more than anything else, the shape the mystery eventually took in the public imagination. Roughly 4 months after the disappearance, with no new leads and no physical evidence to work from, the case began to attract a different kind of attention, not just local press, but a handful of national outlets that had picked up the strangeness of the locked door detail and run with it, sending reporters out to Mercer County for a week or two at a time, interviewing whoever would talk, photographing the house from the road, since Diane had, by then, asked that no one be allowed onto the property itself. This attention was, by Diane's own account, a double-edged thing. It kept the case alive in public memory, which she has said she is grateful for to this day, but it also brought with it a wave of theories from people who had never set foot in Mercer County, who knew the case only through second-hand summaries and speculation, and some of those theories took on a life of their own that the actual evidence never supported. One persistent rumor, which surfaced first on an online forum dedicated to unsolved disappearances roughly 6 months after the case became public, suggested that the Callaways had been involved in some kind of underground religious group, a theory built almost entirely on the fact that Tom had once, years earlier, briefly attended a non-denominational men's retreat organized by a regional ministry that some online commenters linked, tenuously and without much actual evidence, to a separate, unrelated group that had drawn media scrutiny elsewhere in the country for unrelated reasons. Investigators looked into it, because investigators look into everything, however unlikely, and found nothing. No financial contributions beyond the ordinary tithing Tom and Renee did at their own modest Baptist church. No correspondence. No travel records suggesting any involvement with any other organization. The theory persisted online regardless, the way these things tend to, because absence of evidence is, for a certain kind of internet sleuth, simply evidence of how well hidden the truth must be, a logic that frustrated Diane considerably and that she has spoken about with some bitterness in later interviews, describing the way strangers online constructed entire narratives about her sister's family based on nothing at all. Narratives that she then had to field questions about, again and again, for years. A second rumor, somewhat more grounded but ultimately just as unproductive, centered on a brief period roughly 2 years before the disappearance, when Tom had taken on a second, part-time job, doing weekend maintenance work for a small private property management company that handled several vacation rental homes scattered around the lake roughly 20 minutes from Mercer County proper. Investigators traced every property Tom had ever worked on, interviewed the company's owner and his 2 other employees, and found nothing connecting any of those properties, or any of the people who had stayed in them, to the Callaways' disappearance. The job itself had ended amicably more than a year before October, when Tom's hours at the lumber yard increased and he no longer had the bandwidth for the side work. The owner of the management company, a man named Russ Tilden, described Tom in his interview in almost exactly the same terms everyone else used. Reliable, quiet, the kind of employee you never had to think twice about. The kind of man, Russ said, who you'd trust with a key to your own house without a second thought. A comment that, in light of everything that followed, struck more than one investigator as unintentionally unsettling. There was also, for a brief period, roughly a year into the investigation, a theory involving carbon monoxide poisoning, raised initially by a retired toxicologist who had followed press coverage of the case and reached out to the department with a hypothesis that some catastrophic undetected leak from the home's aging furnace system might have incapacitated or killed the family in their sleep, after which, the theory went, perhaps animal activity, perhaps some other environmental factor, might account for the absence of remains within the house, with the actual bodies somehow removed from the property by a third party who discovered the scene before the mail carrier did, for reasons of their own. The theory had a certain grim internal logic, and investigators took it seriously enough to have the home's furnace and all gas lines tested extensively. They found no leak, no malfunction, no carbon monoxide residue of the kind that would be expected to linger in a home's ductwork and insulation even months after exposure. The furnace, like nearly everything else in that house, was found to be in good working order, recently serviced, with no anomalies of any kind. The theory was formally ruled out within a matter of weeks, but it lingered for a while in public discussion of the case, in the way that theories with a plausible scientific shape tend to outlast their actual evidentiary support. Perhaps the strangest formal theory pursued by investigators, and the one that generated the most internal disagreement within the department itself, involved the possibility of some kind of elaborate, premeditated insurance fraud scheme. The idea that the Callaways had staged their own disappearance, not to escape danger or debt, but to benefit from a life insurance policy or some other financial instrument that would pay out to a surviving relative after a period of confirmed absence. This theory was pursued with some seriousness for several months, primarily because it was, on paper, one of the only theories that offered any motive at all for a family with no apparent enemies and no apparent crisis to vanish so completely. Investigators subpoenaed records for every insurance policy associated with any member of the family, going back well over a decade, and found nothing. A modest term life policy through Tom's employer, standard and unremarkable, naming Renee as the sole beneficiary, with a payout that, while meaningful to a family of their modest means, was nowhere near substantial enough to plausibly motivate the kind of elaborate disappearance the locked house scenario would have required. More tellingly, that policy, like Renee's pension, has never been claimed by anyone in the 9 years since, a fact that effectively ended any serious consideration of the fraud theory within the department, though it has continued to circulate occasionally in online discussions of the case, usually accompanied by the suggestion that whoever benefited from the scheme simply hadn't yet felt safe enough to come forward, a suggestion with no supporting evidence whatsoever, but that nonetheless proved difficult to fully extinguish in public conversation. In the third year of the investigation, with the case largely stalled and public attention beginning to fade, Diane made the decision to commission an independent review of the entire case file, hiring a private investigator named Walter Cobb, a former state police detective with a long career in cold case work, to go through everything from the beginning with fresh eyes, unconstrained by departmental procedure or institutional fatigue. Cobb spent nearly 5 months on the case, much of it simply rereading and cross-referencing the existing file, looking for anything the original investigators might have overlooked or under-prioritized in the chaos and urgency of the first weeks. His final report to Diane, which she later made portions of public on her website, did not solve the case, but it did surface a handful of small inconsistencies that had gone largely unremarked upon in the original investigation. Details that, while not conclusive of anything, added further texture to the case's already considerable strangeness. The first of these involved the timing of the rainfall on the night of the 12th. The official weather data for the region indicated rain beginning around 7 p.m. and continuing, with brief interruptions, through roughly 2 a.m. the following morning. Cobb noted, however, that the soil samples taken from directly beneath the home's exterior window wells, a detail logged by the original forensic team but never specifically analyzed for its implications, showed moisture patterns suggesting those particular patches of ground had remained dry for several hours longer than the surrounding soil, as though something, however briefly, had shielded them from the rain that fell everywhere else around the house. Cobb's report stopped short of offering any explanation for this, noting only that it might reflect nothing more than the ordinary effects of the house's own eaves and roofline directing runoff in uneven patterns, a mundane explanation that several other consultants who later reviewed his findings considered the most likely one. But Cobb himself, in a brief personal note appended to the end of his formal report, wrote that he had stood in that exact spot himself, on a similarly rainy evening nearly a year into his investigation, watching where the water actually fell, and that he had not been able to fully satisfy himself that the eaves alone explained the discrepancy he'd found in the original samples. The second detail Cobb surfaced involved the timeline of Tom's truck. The vehicle, found in the driveway exactly where it was always parked, had its engine block fully coaled by the time deputies arrived on the morning of the 14th, consistent with not having been driven in at least the previous day, likely longer. But Cobb noted a small, easily overlooked detail in the original scene photographs. The truck's driver's side door, while closed, was not fully latched, sitting instead in that particular almost closed position a door settles into when it has been pushed shut without quite enough force to engage the latch, the kind of thing that happens when someone is in a hurry, or distracted, or interrupted mid-motion. No one in the original investigation had flagged this as significant, in part because an unlatched truck door in a rural driveway is, on its own, almost meaningless, the kind of thing that happens to nearly every vehicle at some point through nothing more than carelessness. But set against everything else, the made bed, the unfinished homework, the cold coffee, the door that didn't quite close, it became, in Cobb's framing, one more small data point, suggesting that whatever happened that night had begun, at least in its earliest moments, as something ordinary, something interrupted mid-motion, rather than something planned or anticipated by anyone inside that house. Cobb also revisited the question of Audrey's late-night internet searches, bringing in his own digital forensics consultant to take a second look at the laptop's full activity logs rather than just the browser history that had been the focus of the original analysis. This deeper review surfaced something the original investigation had missed entirely: a series of brief, otherwise unremarkable voice memo recordings stored in a notes application on the device, 11 of them in total, recorded over roughly the final 6 weeks before the disappearance, each one only a few seconds long, none of them ever played back or shared as far as the metadata could determine, each one seemingly abandoned mid-recording almost as soon as it began. Cobb's consultant was able to recover and clean up the audio on all 11. 9 of them contained nothing but ambient room noise, the faint sound of a fan, traffic outside, what might have been Audrey's own breathing close to the microphone. But 2 of them, the consultant determined after extensive cleanup and analysis, contained a few seconds of Audrey's own voice, quiet, hesitant, as though she had begun to say something and then stopped herself before finishing the thought. In the first, recorded roughly 5 weeks before the disappearance, her voice says only, "I don't know how to say this without it sounding," before the recording cuts off. In the second, recorded 11 days before the disappearance, she says, even more quietly, almost a whisper, "If something happens, I want someone to know that I..." and then nothing further. The recording ending abruptly, the file's metadata showing it was deleted from the visible interface, almost immediately after being recorded. though the underlying data remained recoverable on the device's storage. This detail, when Cobb shared it with Diane, was, by her own account, one of the most difficult moments of the entire 9 years that followed the disappearance. More difficult in some ways than the original discovery itself, because it suggested, however incompletely, that Audrey had been carrying something, some private knowledge or fear or premonition, in the final weeks of her life that she had never been able to fully articulate, not even to herself. Not even alone in her own room with no one listening. Investigators reopened contact with Audrey's friends and teachers following this discovery, asking more pointed questions about her state of mind in those final weeks, but found nothing further. No friend she had confided in, no teacher she had approached, no indication of what, specifically, she might have meant. The sentence simply ends, both times, exactly where it ends, and nothing in the years since has ever completed it. Cobb's report, when finally delivered to Diane in full, concluded with a section he titled, somewhat unusually for a formal investigative document, "What We Are Left With," in which he wrote candidly that despite 5 months of dedicated work, despite uncovering several details the original investigation had missed, he had not been able to construct any single coherent theory that satisfactorily explained the totality of the evidence. "I have spent a career closing cases that other investigators considered unsolvable," he wrote, "and I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Whitcomb, in a way that I understand may not be what you hope to hear. I do not believe this case will be solved through conventional investigative means. Every theory I have tested collapses against some detail of the physical evidence. I do not say this to suggest anything supernatural, and I want to be clear that I do not believe in such things. I say it only because, in 30 years of this work, I have never encountered a case where the absence of explanation was itself so total, so resistant to every framework I know how to apply." In the years following Cobb's report, the case settled into the quieter rhythm that has defined it ever since. Periodic renewed interest around each anniversary, the occasional tip that leads nowhere, Diane's ongoing, patient stewardship of her family's memory in the face of a silence that has never once broken. A true crime podcast covered the case extensively in its 6th year, drawing a new wave of public attention and, with it, a new wave of theories, most of them recycling ground that investigators had already covered years earlier. Though one episode did prompt a previously unknown witness to come forward, a former classmate of Audrey's, by then in her mid-20s and living several states away, who had moved out of Mercer County shortly after the disappearance and had, by her own account, never spoken to investigators at the time because her family had left so abruptly afterward that no one had ever followed up with her. Her contribution to the case file was modest, but added one more small, strange thread to the tapestry. She recalled that roughly a month before the disappearance, Audrey had asked her, in what seemed at the time like an idle, philosophical kind of question, the way teenagers sometimes ask each other late at night, whether she believed a person could ever truly disappear without dying, whether there might be some way of simply ceasing to be findable, while still, in some sense, continuing to exist. The classmate said she hadn't thought much of the question at the time, had given some unremarkable teenage answer about how everyone leaves a trace somewhere, a receipt, a camera, a memory in someone else's head, and that Audrey had only nodded slowly and changed the subject, in a way that the classmate, looking back across nearly a decade and through the lens of everything that followed, now found impossible to interpret as anything other than significant, though she was equally quick to admit that hindsight has a way of making even ordinary conversations feel like omens, that she could not be certain she wasn't simply reading meaning into a memory that had, at the time, meant nothing at all. In the years that followed the podcast's coverage, the case took on a kind of second life online that Diane has described as both a comfort and a burden in equal measure. Forums dedicated entirely to the Calloway disappearance sprang up, populated by amateur researchers who pored over every available document, every interview transcript, every scrap of public record, looking for patterns no one else had noticed. Some of this work was genuinely useful, One researcher, a woman with a background in cartography who went by a pseudonym online and has never publicly revealed her real identity, produced a detailed topographical analysis of the property and surrounding terrain that helped narrow the search radius for a renewed cadaver dog sweep conducted in the case's 7th year. A sweep that, like all the ones before it, found nothing, but that at least allowed investigators to formally rule out several additional square miles of forest that had never been thoroughly covered in the original search. Other contributions were less useful, and some were actively harmful. A wave of online speculation, roughly 5 years, falsely implicated a former neighbor of the family who had moved away years before the disappearance and had no connection to the case whatsoever. Based entirely on a misread public record and the kind of confident, performative certainty that spreads quickly in online communities built around unsolved mysteries. That man, whose name was eventually cleared after the sheriff's department issued a public statement confirming he had been fully eliminated as a person of interest years earlier, has spoken publicly only once about the experience, describing it as a strange and frightening period in which strangers online constructed an entire narrative of guilt around him, using nothing but coincidence and the human need to find someone, anyone, to blame for a tragedy that otherwise refused to make sense. Diane has had to navigate this landscape carefully over the years, trying to keep the case in public memory without feeding the kind of speculative frenzy that, she has said, ultimately serves the curiosity of strangers more than it serves the actual search for her family. She has declined, on more than one occasion, to participate in projects she felt crossed a line into exploitation rather than genuine investigation, turning down at least 2 television production companies that approached her in the case's 4th and 6th years with proposals for dramatized reenactments she felt would sensationalize details that were, to her, simply the unbearable facts of her sister's last ordinary evening. "I don't need anyone to make this scarier than it already is," she told one interviewer who asked why she'd declined a particular production deal. "I lived the scary part. I'm still living it. What I need is someone to find them, and after 9 years, I've had to make peace with the fact that may never happen, and that the only thing I can actually control is how their story gets told in the meantime." It was roughly in the case's 7th year that investigators received what remains, to this day, the closest thing to a credible new lead the case has produced since the original investigation went cold. A long-haul truck driver named Frank Asher, passing through a rest stop nearly 400 miles from Mercer County, reported to local police in that jurisdiction that he believed he had seen a woman matching an age-progressed image of Renee Calloway. The sheriff's department had commissioned several age progression renderings over the years, standard practice in long-term missing persons cases, updating the family's likely appearance to account for the years that had passed. Working behind the counter of a small diner attached to the rest stop. He hadn't approached her, he said, because something about the interaction had felt wrong to him in a way he struggled to articulate, the woman avoiding eye contact in a manner he described as deliberate rather than simply shy, and he'd waited until he was back on the road before calling it in, uncertain whether he was imagining a resemblance that wasn't really there. Local police visited the diner within hours. The woman in question, while bearing a passing resemblance to the age-progressed rendering, was confirmed through identification and subsequent fingerprinting to be a different person entirely, a woman with no connection to the Calloway family and, as it turned out, her own complicated reasons for avoiding attention that had nothing to do with the case, reasons that police declined to detail publicly out of respect for her privacy. The lead, like every other lead before it, dissolved on contact with verification, but Diane has said that the 4 hours between Asher's call and the confirmation that the woman was not her sister were among the longest of her life, a brief, vertiginous window in which she allowed herself, against her own better judgment, to imagine what it might feel like to have an answer. There have been other near misses over the years, each one following roughly the same emotional arc. A tip, a flare of hope, a period of waiting, and then, almost always, the quiet, anticlimactic confirmation that the lead had led nowhere. A skeletal remain discovered by hikers in a state forest nearly 200 miles away, in the case's 5th year, prompted weeks of anxious waiting before forensic testing confirmed the remains belonged to a man unconnected to the case, missing for entirely separate reasons related to an unrelated disappearance from a different decade. A handwriting sample submitted to the department by a woman claiming to have received an anonymous letter she believed might be from Audrey was analyzed and ultimately determined inconclusive, with the department's documents examiner noting enough similarities to warrant serious consideration, but not enough certainty to draw any firm conclusion. A frustrating middle ground that has never been resolved one way or the other, since the woman who submitted the letter has since become unreachable, her own life having taken turns that made her difficult to locate for follow-up, adding one more thread of unresolved possibility to a case already overflowing with them. Through all of this, the central facts of the case have remained exactly as they were on the morning Dale Whitfield first knocked on that door. A locked house, an undisturbed home, a family that simply ceased to exist somewhere in the space of a single Tuesday evening, leaving behind every material trace of their lives except the lives themselves. Investigators who have worked the case over the years, when pressed in later interviews to offer their own personal theories, separate from anything that could be supported by hard evidence, have tended to retreat into a kind of careful, professional humility that itself speaks to how thoroughly the case has resisted explanation. Sheriff Doss, by then retired, told a reporter on the occasion of the case's 9th anniversary that he had thought about the Callaways nearly every day since the morning he first walked through their door, and that the not knowing had become, for him, its own kind of permanent resident in his thinking, a presence he had simply learned to live alongside rather than resolve. "I caught killers in this county," he said. "I caught a man who buried his own brother in a cornfield, and I caught a woman who set fire to her husband's truck with him still in it. I know what guilt looks like, and what fear looks like, and what a cover-up looks like, even a good one. I never found a single trace of any of that in this case. What I found instead was just an absence, a family-shaped hole where 4 people used to be, and a house that locked itself around that hole like it was trying to keep something in, or keep something out, and damned if I could ever tell you which." The forensic engineer, Holbrook, gave one final interview on the subject roughly 8 years after his original report, by then well into his own retirement, and offered a reflection that has been quoted often in subsequent writing about the case, perhaps because it captures, in plain mechanical language, the precise shape of the impossibility at the case's center. "People ask me sometimes if I think something supernatural happened in that house," he said. "I don't believe in that. I've spent my whole life believing that everything has a mechanism, a reason, a way it works that can be discovered if you look closely enough and long enough. I still believe that, mostly. But I'll tell you the truth, I have never been more thoroughly defeated by a piece of hardware than I was by those locks. Every test I ran told me the same thing. Those doors were locked the ordinary way, by people standing inside them, turning the bolt the way you or I would turn it before going to bed. I don't have an explanation for where those people went afterward. I only know they were there when the doors were locked, and they weren't there 9, 10, however many hours later when the deputies broke in. Somewhere in between those two facts is the whole mystery, and I never found a single thread leading from one to the other." Diane has, over the years, developed her own private rituals around the anniversary of the disappearance, rituals she has spoken about only sparingly in interviews, treating them as something closer to private grief than public information. She visits the house each October the 12th, regardless of how infrequently she goes at other times of the year, and she has said that she always brings something small with her: a violin string, once, the year Audrey would have turned 20, a math workbook for Caleb's age group, the year he would have started high school, small symbolic gestures toward birthdays and milestones that will never actually happen, offerings to a future that exists now only in the conditional tense, the future Diane imagines for them in the quiet moments when she allows herself to imagine anything at all. She has said she doesn't know exactly why she does this, only that it feels important to mark the passage of time for them, even though they are not there to experience it, as though someone needs to keep their lives moving forward in some small symbolic way, even if the actual lives themselves stopped, irrevocably, on an ordinary Tuesday in October 9 years ago. It is in this context, the quiet, accumulated weight of 9 years of unanswered questions, the small rituals, the periodic flares of false hope, the slow erosion of public attention punctuated by occasional renewed interest, that the detail of the calendar takes on its full, unsettling significance. Because everything else about this case, every theory pursued and abandoned, every consultant brought in and ultimately stymied, every neighbor interviewed, and every lead chased down, all of it points toward a single, unbearable conclusion: that whatever happened to the Calloway family happened once, completely, on a single night, and that nothing has moved, nothing has changed, nothing has continued in that house since. The calendar should have been the most reliable confirmation of that stillness, a frozen artifact, October forever, the way Diane herself wanted it to remain. Instead, it has quietly, patiently, contradicted the central fact the entire case otherwise rests upon. Something in that locked and empty house has continued. Something has kept track of the months. Something, perhaps, has been waiting. The Sheriff's Department, for its part, has been careful in its official statements never to suggest anything beyond the prosaic. The most recent public update on the case, issued on the occasion of its 9th anniversary, reiterates simply that the investigation remains open, that any new information will be pursued with full diligence, and that the department continues to ask anyone with knowledge relevant to the disappearance of Tom, Renee, Audrey, and Caleb Calloway to come forward. It makes no mention of the calendar. That detail exists now mostly in the margins of the case's public memory, repeated in the podcast episodes and forum threads and long-form articles that have accumulated around the story over the years, treated by some as a meaningless footnote, easily explained, they argue, by some undocumented visit, some forgotten access to the property, some mundane answer that simply hasn't surfaced yet, and treated by others as the single most important piece of evidence the case has ever produced, proof that whatever happened in that house did not end the night it began, that something of it, in some form no one has been able to name, persists there still. Diane herself has never landed firmly on either interpretation. In her most recent public statement, given on the morning of the 9th anniversary, standing in the gravel driveway where Dale Whitfield once stood 9 years earlier, she spoke for several minutes about her sister, about Tom, about Audrey's quiet determination, and Caleb's endless, joyful noise, the kind of remembrance that has become, by necessity, its own form of keeping them present in a world that has otherwise moved on without them. And then, toward the end of her remarks, almost as an aside, she mentioned the calendar again, and said something that has, since then, become perhaps the single most repeated line in everything ever written or recorded about this case. "I used to think," she said, "that the worst thing that could happen was never finding an answer. Now I think there might be something worse than that. I think the worst thing might be finding a small piece of an answer and realizing it doesn't make anything clearer. It just makes the silence feel less empty. And I don't know if that's a comfort or the most frightening thing I've ever felt in my life. Some days I think it's both." In the month since that anniversary, a quiet and largely unofficial arrangement has taken shape around the property, one that says as much about the case's strange afterlife as any piece of physical evidence ever recovered from it. A retired deputy who had worked the original scene back when he was a young patrolman, a man named Roy Castellan, took it upon himself, without any formal department sanction, to drive past the house once a week, slowing at the end of the gravel driveway, checking simply that nothing looked disturbed, that no broken window or forced door suggested the kind of mundane vandalism that sometimes befalls abandoned rural properties. He has done this for nearly 6 years now, unpaid, unasked, a private ritual of his own that he has described, when pressed, as something he doesn't fully understand himself, except that the case had gotten into him early in his career in a way few others ever did, and he had never quite been able to put it down. He keeps a small notebook in his glove box, he admitted once to a local reporter who'd heard about his habit secondhand, in which he jots a line or two after every drive-by. Nothing official, nothing that would ever make it into a case file, just a private record of a house that, by every reasonable measure, should have nothing left to report on, and yet, in his own words, never quite feels finished. It was Castellan, in fact, who first noticed, on a routine pass roughly 7 years after the disappearance, that the porch light, long disconnected from the property's electrical supply after Diane had service shut off, appeared, for a fraction of a second, as his headlights swept across the front of the house, to catch a glint of something behind the bulb's old, clouded glass, as though the fixture itself had been disturbed, the bulb perhaps replaced, though a subsequent inspection found the same decade-old bulb still seated in the socket, dust thick across its surface, no sign that it had been touched at all. He logged it in his private notebook and mentioned it, almost reluctantly, to Diane the next time their paths crossed at a small diner in town, where she sometimes stopped on her way out to the property. She did not seem surprised, he said later. She only nodded, the way a person nods at something they have already, somewhere in themselves, made peace with not being able to explain. It is this accumulation, more than any single piece of evidence, that has come to define how the Calloway case is now understood by those who have followed it closely over the years. Not as a single, solvable mystery with a hidden answer waiting somewhere to be uncovered, but as a slow accretion of small, individually dismissible strangenesses that, taken together, refuse to resolve into anything coherent. A locked house, a calm dog, a flickering light no one can explain, a turned calendar, a word, possibly spoken, possibly imagined, captured at the edge of a microphone's range on a rainy October night, a daughter who recorded half-finished sentences she never let herself complete. None of it, on its own, proves anything. All of it, together, has kept 4 names alive in the minds of strangers 9 years after the people who carried those names should have, by any ordinary measure of how the world works, long since faded into the quiet anonymity of an unremarkable rural family living an unremarkable rural life. The Mercer County Sheriff's Department continues, even now, to field the occasional tip, most of them swiftly investigated and just as swiftly closed out, the file growing thicker each year, with possibilities considered and discarded, the central mystery no smaller for any of it. Current Sheriff Marisol Vega, who took over the role after Doss's retirement and inherited the case along with everything else that comes with the position, has said in her own limited public comments on the matter that she reviews the file personally each October, not because she expects to find something that dozens of investigators before her missed, but because she believes, as she put it once, that some cases deserve to be looked at again every year, just so the people in them know somebody is still looking, even if looking has never once led anywhere. And so the house remains, out past the edge of town, down a gravel road that fewer and fewer people have reason to drive anymore. Its windows dark, its doors locked, its small kitchen calendar, whatever month it has by now been quietly turned to, by hands no one has ever caught in the act, hanging exactly where it has always hung, on a wall, in a room where, on an ordinary Tuesday 9 years ago, 2 coffee mugs went cold, a math problem went unfinished, and a family of 4 stepped, for reasons no one has ever been able to name, out of the only kind of existence anyone left behind has ever been able to find them in again. Diane has said, in the years since, that she no longer visits the house as often as she once did. When asked why, in that same anniversary interview, she paused for a long moment before answering.
Who is she?
And what she finally said has become, in its own quiet way, the closing note that nearly every account of this case eventually returns to. the line that sits longest with anyone who spends time with the story afterward. "I keep thinking," she said, "that if I go back enough times, I'll catch whoever it is, or whatever it is. And some nights I want that more than anything. And other nights, I think about standing in that kitchen, in the dark, and feeling that calendar turn beneath my own hand. And I think, I don't actually want to know. I think there might be answers in this world that aren't actually for us. I think some doors lock themselves for a reason. And I think maybe I should stop trying to find out what that reason is." The Mercer County Sheriff's Department lists the case of Tom, Renee, Audrey, and Caleb Calloway as open and unsolved to this day. No arrests have ever been made. No bodies have ever been found. No credible sighting of any family member has ever been confirmed in the 9 years since that ordinary Tuesday in October. The house still stands on Birch Hollow Road, its doors locked, its windows latched, the way a house is supposed to be secured against whatever might try to get in. Somewhere inside it, on a kitchen wall, a calendar continues, even now, to be turned forward, 1 month at a time, by hands no one has ever seen.